Welcome to Gracefully Greying. I am your host, attorney Henry Gornbein. Today on Gracefully Greying, we are continuing this important conversation with Barbara McQuade, who is the former U.S. Attorney from the Eastern District of Michigan, U of M law professor, MSNBC correspondent, and the author of this very important and critical book, Attack from Within. We left the discussion with our first show where we were talking about some of the vulnerabilities. And I would like to start on that point, Barb, with the fact that in your book, you say that some of America's best virtues are also our worst vulnerabilities. What about American democracy makes us particularly susceptible to disinformation?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things, Henry. I actually listed a number of them in my book, but I'll just mention a couple of them now. One, I think, is our diversity. We are a nation of immigrants, other than our Native American neighbors who were here before us. And as a result, we have people who are of different colors, different ethnicities, different traditions, different religions. I think that is one of our greatest strengths. I think a great example of the strength of our diversity is in the Olympic Games. Why is it that the United States is so good in the Olympics? I think it's because we have all these different kinds of people, different kinds of bodies. We have tall people, short people, strong people, fast people, tiny little people who are great gymnasts. That is what makes us so strong. I think our diversity is one of the things that makes our country so great. And yet, it is something that allows people to stoke division in society, to try to pit us against each other, to try to suggest that, one person's gain is another person's loss. And in fact, all of us can contribute and live together in society. But those are some of the fault lines in society. And there are people who will stoke division among people based on religion or based on race. So I think that is one of those strengths that becomes a weakness. I think the other one that is so important is our cherished right to free speech that is protected by the First Amendment. I think everybody would agree that it is essential to democracy to be able to speak out against our government when we disagree with policies. It is one of the main hallmarks of a democracy and one of the flaws of countries with more authoritarian forms of government. And yet it is that First Amendment that makes it so difficult, I think, for us to push back. Anytime there is any suggestion of regulation on social media, the big tech giants push back and say, oh, that would violate my First Amendment rights. And people tend to use it, I think, as a shield, even where it may not exist. And so although the First Amendment right is critically important, it's important to remember that no constitutional right is absolute. In the same way we can't yell fire in a crowded theater, we have criminalized certain kinds of speech. You can't commit perjury, which is to lie under oath, because even though you're exercising your free speech, the government has said there are overriding interests that are more important than your right to free speech. We're in a courtroom. You can't threaten to kill somebody because, again, even though you might have a free speech right to say that, it is something where there is a greater harm that occurs than we want to protect. And so the Supreme Court has come up with a rule for when we should decide whether speech should be protected or should be in that limited category where limitations are permitted. And that is when there's a compelling governmental interest, like protecting truth and the rule of law in courtrooms or protecting people's public safety from threats, when there's a compelling governmental interest and there's a limitation that is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. So you can't say all speech about a certain topic is prohibited, or you can't say things that are conservative or liberal. Those would be prohibited. But to be narrowly tailored, I think, is something that we could achieve, which is why I think that there are solutions to some of these problems that would not run afoul of the First Amendment, things that focus more on process than focus on substance and content. But I think we have to be careful not to just reflexively react when someone says First Amendment, free speech, censorship, because those are the claims of people who want to hide behind the First Amendment and maybe a rudimentary idea of what it protects without really appreciating the nuance.
Barb, can you explain some of the ways that disinformation is harming our democracy?
Yes, and I think this is something we are going to feel acutely in the 2024 election. And so already we have seen states enact new laws since 2020 to protect against imaginary voter fraud. There was no fraud in the 2020 election. It was a fair, accurate, secure election. And yet, nonetheless, in states like Georgia, Florida, Texas, Arizona, Wisconsin, laws have been passed making it more difficult to vote. And when you ask people why they sign these things into law, they say to prevent voter fraud. Even Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, signed a law making it more difficult for people to vote. And when asked why, he said to prevent all the fraud. This is somebody who stood up to Donald Trump, was one of the real heroes of 2020, and said there was no fraud in Georgia in 2020. And yet even he, a Republican governor, signed legislation saying that it was important to sign these laws that shorten the window for early voting, that make it more difficult to vote by mail, that reduce the receptacles for collecting absentee ballots. And he did so because of all the fraud, which of course is simply a pretext for making it harder to vote. In addition, disinformation, I think, is going to harm our right to vote coming up in 2024 in three major ways. One is by influencing who we vote for with false claims about candidates, dampening voter turnout in groups that are likely to vote in one way or another, or simply undermining public confidence in democracy altogether. So already we have seen some of these tactics employed in the United States. In the New Hampshire primary, there were fake robocalls generated using artificial intelligence made to sound like the voice of Joe Biden. And those calls went to many homes in New Hampshire, urging voters to stay home and not waste their vote in the primary and to save it for the general election. Now, first of all, that doesn't even make any sense, right? You can vote in the primary and in the general. But it sounded just like Joe Biden, complete with all of his Joe Bidenisms, like references to malarkey and other things. I've listened to the recording and it sounds pretty good. Imagine if you got that recording and you're a voter and you said, oh, Joe Biden is saying stay home. I'm a loyal Democrat. I want to support him. I guess I better do what he says. Or imagine getting a recording on election day that says, I'm calling from your polling place where the power is out. We've decided that you should come back on Wednesday and cast your vote then instead. How many people might believe that to be true? So that's problematic. I think all of these claims we're hearing now about not only Donald Trump, but other members of the Republican Party who are saying they will not commit to accepting the results of the election until they know that it wasn't rigged. I mean, that just puts that seed out there, plants that seed that our elections are rigged and that people should not have confidence in democracy. That's a real harm to our elections. And it's already, Henry, harming other democracies around the world where we're seeing democratic backsliding in a number of countries like Hungary, in Turkey, in Venezuela, in the Philippines. Certainly, Russia has had these issues, and China. After the attack on our Capitol on January 6th, 2021, which was, of course, a terrible attack on our democracy caused by disinformation of a stolen election, we heard officials in Russia point to that as evidence that the United States was no longer the model for democracy around the world, and said that American democracy was limping on both feet. Since World War II, it has been the foreign policy of our country to lift up democracies all around the world on the theory that it makes us safer to have other countries that are democracies. And instead, we're seeing this democratic backsliding because they point to January 6th as evidence that democracy doesn't work. In China, President Xi has said, again, that January 6th was an example of how democracy is a failed experiment, and that, in fact, a better system of government is a strong authoritarian government like they have in China, because after all, the point isn't democracy. The point is prosperity, and a strong governmental leader can deliver prosperity better than can democracy. Of course, in China, they lock up dissidents and journalists and protesters, but that's besides the point. And so in all of these ways, disinformation is already harming our democracy.
It's terrifying. And what can I say? The more I listen to you, the more I can see that this is just the beginning. I mean, we've got, 4 months until the general election. So everything's going to be heating up and there's going to be more and more disinformation. Your book also argues that disinformation is eroding the rule of law. How is this happening? And why don't you show our viewers your book?
Oh, thanks. So I've got a copy of the book here, Attack from Within. And in fact, the cover design, it was done by a cover artist. And I really appreciate the cover design because it's a fist of authoritarianism bursting through the country, because the idea is that this attack of disinformation is coming from within our own country. And how is it eroding the rule of law? We are seeing false claims attacking the FBI, our Department of Justice, our courts, referring to them as election interference, alleging falsely that Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg is somehow assigned by Joe Biden to charge Donald Trump with crimes. Attacks on judges, calling the judge assigned to preside over the federal election interference case an election interferer. All of these things are planting seeds that undermine respect for the rule of law. And so we have seen some of these judges be the target of threats, horrible threats to kill them based on these false claims that somehow they're involved in a illegal effort to undermine Donald Trump. We've seen threats against Jack Smith, the prosecutor. We've seen swatting at his home. You know, that's this effort to call police SWAT teams and say that there's an armed gunman at a house and they need to send the SWAT team. And, you know, a person opens the door to find armed police officers surrounding their home. All of these things tend to have a chilling effect on people who work in the criminal justice system, whether that's prosecutors, judges, jurors, or court staff. And it's a very worrisome thing. You may recall that in the early days of the Trump trial in Manhattan, there was a juror who on day 2 decided to excuse herself because she believed she had been outed by people online and it had been falsely said about her on Fox News that she was a liberal who had lied about her background to sneak onto the trial, onto the jury. And she was worried about her safety and therefore her ability to serve as an impartial juror. All of these things, Henry, undermine the rule of law, which is supposed to be decided based on facts and law and not on politics. And the concern I have long term about this erosion of the rule of law is that when people don't respect the rule of law, they are inclined to disobey it or to take the law into their own hands and engage in vigilante violence. I mean, the greatest example of that altogether was on January 6th, when people believed these false claims of a stolen election, and rather than allow the courts to resolve those disputes, as they had, people decided to take the law into their own hands, listening to the words of Donald Trump that you have to fight for your country and try to use brute force to overturn the results of the election and prevent the certification of Joe Biden as president. I mean, that's vigilantism, that's lawlessness. And that is the end result of what happens when people attack the rule of law.
You know, what's frightening is the fact that people have short memories, because so many people attacked Donald Trump for what he did and said he was unfit for office and they would never vote for him, they would never support him. Here we are, less than 4 years later, and it seems like it's receded completely. Or now you've got the fact that Donald Trump is calling the rioters patriots, having them sing a song out of prison and saying they'll be pardoned. I mean, what does this say for the rule of law and for our society?
Yeah, it's really shocking to me. You know, Liz Cheney spoke about this when she presided over the January 6th committee that was investigating the attacks, how shortly after January 6th, many of her Republican colleagues were calling for the impeachment of Donald Trump, the prosecution of these people. And even Mitch McConnell talked about how he was voting not to convict Donald Trump in his impeachment because there were courts of law who could take care of this. And then, you know, once they saw which way the political winds were blowing, have begun repeating this same disinformation that these are hostages. That's a term that Donald Trump uses about the January 6th attackers who've been prosecuted criminally and are serving prison sentences. And now we hear people like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene repeat that phrase, that they're hostages. And even Representative Elise Stefanik of New York calls them hostages. I mean, this idea that they're somehow political prisoners for being convicted with attacking police officers. Donald Trump's newest line is that the police lured them in and enabled them and entrapped them into these crimes by setting them up, by letting them into the Capitol. If you watch the video that day or hear the testimony of some of those police officers, you know that this was not something where the officers were letting them in. They fought heroically in hand-to-hand combat with these attackers on January 6th. So this is, to me, the ultimate example of disinformation and spin. We know that there are those who have gathered some video and shown it on Fox News saying, look, it was peaceful that day. Well, you can always show some corner of the Capitol at a different time of day and say, here's what didn't happen that day. That does not refute the fact that there was this horrible attack on our Capitol. And, you know, Liz Cheney paid the price for truth. She chose truth over her political tribe by saying what happened that day, by joining that committee, by presiding over that, by voting against Donald Trump, by speaking out. And she lost her primary election as a result of that. But so many other politicians are willing to put their personal careers or their political party over country. And, you know, as Liz Cheney said, we can't long be a democracy without a commitment of truth. And yet we are seeing so many political actors choosing tribe over truth.
It's terrifying. Let's jump to another thing, and that is, we've talked about the problems. We've talked about all the horrible things that are going on and the fact that part of a democracy is the right to free speech. But what are some of the antidotes? What can we do to fight the disinformation, to help save our democracy? I mean, it's almost as if we are at a crossroads where there seems to be more acrimony and more polarization in our society than perhaps any time since the 1850s prior to the Civil War. So what do we do? Where do we go now?
Yes. So I know it's been a lot of doom and gloom, but I believe that we can solve these problems. You know, these are problems created by humans, and problems created by humans can be solved by humans. I think a big part of our problem right now is that we are living in an age where the internet has reached kind of its adolescence. It's not really in its infancy anymore. It's in its awkward teenage years, or, you know, I've raised teenagers, you know, when they roll their eyes at you and sass back and you feel like you've lost control of them, but they come back to you if you handle things and play your cards right. And I think we can do the same with the internet. You know, we've passed some laws. In 1996, we passed a law right on the dawn of the internet age. And we gave legal immunity to internet service providers that have evolved into these social media companies that say they have no legal liability for anything that gets posted online. And so as a result, they've become cesspools for false information. And I think there's some things we can do to change that. And we ought to be thinking about the internet differently today than we thought about it in 1996. In 1996, we wanted to foster innovation and encourage people to invest in the internet and see all the ways that it could be used creatively to advance society. And, you know, things have changed. It's sort of like raising a baby alligator in your bathtub. You know, at first it's adorable and cute. And then when it's grown, you realize it's grown into a man-eating predator. And maybe you need to change some of the ways that you deal with this thing that has become much more dangerous. And so I think there's some things we can do online to protect ourselves. Number one, the first thing that we can do is protect the way that social media companies scrape our private data. They know more about us than we know about ourselves. When I sign online, I get offers to buy Detroit Tigers baseball caps. How do they know? Yes, I would like to buy a Detroit Tigers baseball cap because they look at my likes and my shares and my habits online, and they know all of the things that I look at. And as a result of that, there are people who buy this data through their data brokers who sell it to commercial enterprises and also political operatives. And as a result, they know how to micro-target me and you and all of us with things that will push our buttons. What I see is different from what you see, Henry, because we have different preferences and different biases, and it's different for all of us. And so because of that ability to scrape all of our data, they have collected information that is used against us. So I think that we need to get our arms around the way our data is collected and used. And we can do that. That doesn't have any First Amendment implication. We can protect our own data. I think another thing that is something we can change online is the algorithms that are used by social media companies. We know from a whistleblower who was a former data scientist for Facebook, her name is Frances Haugens, that Facebook uses algorithms to push out content that is designed to outrage us. Because the more outraged we are, the longer we stay online, because we got to respond to that thing. We got to send it to our friend and say, can you believe this? And the longer we're online, the more they can charge to advertisers. So to Facebook, outrage equals money. And so can't we control those algorithms that are designed to outrage us, or at least require disclosure and transparency so that if we're being manipulated, we can know it? I think another thing that we can do is to require disclosure of who is paying for political ads online. Currently, that's not done. And so we see things and we think that they belong to ordinary American grassroots groups, when in fact they could be paid for by Russia or by special interests or by some individual. On television and on radio, there are rules about disclosure of who's paying for a political ad. You may hear things like, I'm Joe Biden and I approve this ad, or I'm Donald Trump and I approve this ad. That's not true online. And so that is a rule we could certainly change. So a lot of these things are really about transparency and more information so that we know when there are political actors or disinformers out there who are trying to fool us.
You know, I'm thinking about the fact that another antidote is the courts. I mean, you've got the fact that Alex Jones and InfoWars was stung very badly with a huge verdict against him, where he's now gone bankrupt and is now trying to raise money to pay. And this comes to mind because this is the graduation of the survivors of the Sandy Hook massacre that goes back to December of 2012, actually. And so you've got the fact that there's Fox News had to pay a huge settlement, and they have another lawsuit pending with regard to the disinformation with regard to the last election. And you've got Breitbart. You've got the fact that Rudy Giuliani has been sued successfully. Donald Trump has been sued successfully with regard to the lies and the allegations with regard to the sexual assault. So I guess the courts are one of the antidotes, but what are some of the other things that you can tell us about, Barb?
Yeah, I agree with you that the courts have been very helpful in defamation lawsuits. Not everybody has the wherewithal to pursue a defamation lawsuit, and sort of says, shrugs and says it's not worth it. But those examples that you pointed to, as well as I would point to Dominion Voting Systems, which received more than $700 million from Fox News for false claims that they were flipping votes from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. I think those are really important because not only does it hold the disinformer accountable, I think it provides an important deterrent message to other people who might be inclined to engage in similar behavior. But some other things that we can do, Henry, I think to build resilience and play defense against some of these offensive tactics are to improve our own media literacy. One of the things that Finland has done quite effectively in their efforts to protect themselves from disinformation from their neighbor Russia, which has been, they're in proximity to Russia, and so they've been bombarded with disinformation for decades. They have taken to teaching media literacy in their schools with great success, helping people understand that you can't believe everything you read. And so, being not completely refusing to believe everything you read, but using some good strategies to be a skeptic, to confirm that what you're reading is true. So if you see a claim that is surprising to you, looking for a second source to see if other sources are reporting it as well. One of the things we're seeing these days is a Russian group called Doppelganger has replicated what appears to be genuine news outlets in the United States with names like the Chicago Chronicle or DC Weekly that aren't even real, and then they report claims. If a claim's real, then multiple news outlets are going to have it. So don't just believe what you see based on the news outlet. Another is don't just believe the headline. Sometimes headlines have nothing to do with the story itself. I saw a headline the other day, Henry, that caused me to click on the story, which is the whole purpose of these outrageous headlines. And it said, Caitlin Clark media meltdown. That was the headline. You know, Caitlin Clark, of course, is this very good basketball player who played at Iowa and is now in the WNBA. And I thought, oh my gosh, she must have melted down in the media. And when I read the story, you know what it was? It was about a reporter who had said outrageous things about her and used a sexist slur about her in a press conference. It was he who had melted down and not Caitlin Clark. But to read that headline, you would have thought just the opposite is true. So really important to read not just the headline, but also the story. Looking at the story itself, understanding the difference between causation and correlation. Just because two things happen doesn't mean that one caused the other. Or looking at data sets in studies. You know, research studies show that X is true or that Y is true. Well, how big was the sample size? And looking to that sample size. Was it 2,000 subjects or was it 2? Because that can make a big difference. Looking at the evidence that supports a claim, looking at the source of a claim. Is that someone that is credible? All of those things can help us in our own media literacy when we are looking to vet claims and understand whether they're true. You know, just because we read it online doesn't mean we should believe it to be true.
Barb, we barely scratched the surface. We're running out of time, but how can someone obtain your book? I mean, it's more reading for everyone, really.
Well, thanks so much for saying that. It's available in fine bookstores everywhere throughout our area, all of the independent bookstores. Barnes & Noble has it. You can also find it at my website, has lots of links where you can buy it. That's barbaramcquade.com. Also available on Amazon. Here's another look at it. And I'd love for people to read it. And my goal, again, is to educate people so that we can help build resilience for ourselves, our families, and our society against disinformation.
It's an important must-read. Barbara McQuade, I want to thank you so much for being our guest on Gracefully Greying. I want to thank our viewers for watching Gracefully Greying. And of course, I want to thank Bloomfield Cable and our sponsors. Thank you so much. That's it for now with regard to Barbara McQuade and Attack from Within.